Here are the various types of actions that the core is responsible for. And you'll notice that only in one of these does it resemble the actions of a crunch. So this one here is very similar to a crunching action, right? It's called a trunk flexion. We're actually bringing the shoulders down. So that is one action of the core. But what we also see here is we have trunk extension. And this is working the back muscles here. We have trunk lateral flexion, to where we're bending to one side. And then this one, perhaps the most important for any kind of throwing athlete, is trunk rotation or spinal rotation, where we're getting these types of rotation. And if we looked at the throwing action, especially if we looked at it in slow motion, what we'd see is that in the throwing motion, we're going to see all four of these types of core or trunk motion at one time. We're going to see them, or at various points in the throwing motion, we're going to see them all occur during that throwing motion. So only training one, this trunk flexion, is kind of short-sighted. You're not going to get what you want. In fact, this is, if you wanted bang for your buck, this is probably where it's at. So again, in the actions of the core in the throwing action, we have lateral flexion, rotation, flexion like this in a trunk flexion manner, and then extension as well. So we need to train all of them here. And this is a nice picture here, not so much for great mechanics, but what you can see here is this guy setting up the whipping and flailing action. You see how his hip leads the throw. And by leading the throw with the hip, then the shoulder, and then the arm coming through, that's how you set up this whipping and flailing action. And all of that is really going to originate through here. You know, we apply force to the ground a little bit, and that force transfer and the additional rotational force is going to come through the core. So we got a couple muscles that we're looking at here, and I'm not going to bore you with an anatomy lesson, but we do want to look at a couple things. And in this diagram here, we've got our anatomy man, and you can kind of see in this picture, we've got the whole frontal or anterior core highlighted here. That's what most of us think of. Remember, when we talk about core, we're talking about this six-pack. That's what most people think of when they say, oh, he has a strong core. But for athletes, especially throwing athletes, we're concerned more with these muscles that are highlighted in purple there. Right? We want these muscles to the side here that don't look so great on the beach, but do help us out on the mountain. These are the muscles that are going to be responsible for this trunk rotation, the trunk flexion, etc. That's so important in throwing. So we're going to spend a lot of time working not just the rectus abdominis, which is what most people call the abs. It's your six-pack. We're also going to spend a lot of time working on these internal and external obliques, these muscles to the side here, which are really going to help us rotate well. And then for postural stability, injury prevention, we also want to be developing some of this posterior muscles here, the muscles in the back. You know, if we all stood up and you ran your hands down your back, you'd feel that there are two really thick muscles. They feel like 6-inch pieces of rope. Those are among the strongest muscles in your body. And as throwing athletes, or athletes who are participating in a sport which is inherently unilateral or asymmetrical, meaning you're doing things primarily on one side, you have a dominant side, even if you're a switch hitter. Exercising and developing balance and symmetry across the sides is going to be really important. And that's not just from right to left side, but that's also from front to back side. So we can't spend all of our time working on the pretty show muscles in the front. We need to spend some time working on these erector spinae in the back as well if we want to maintain pelvic and hip health. So a couple things that we want to look at here. This first is a question that I'll throw out to you, and hopefully everyone here can answer this already. Are crunches going to be enough for us to, as an exercise as baseball players? No. Pretty clear answer is that's a big N-O right there. Crunches are not the answer. There's nothing really wrong with crunches, but this is how I would explain crunches to you. I'll give you an analogy. If I gave everyone in here a task and I said, we need to hit this 3-inch nail into this piece of wood, and I give everyone in here the option. I say, you can take this hammer here, this steel hammer, or you can hit it into the wall with your forehead. Is there anyone in here that would hit the nail into the wall with their forehead? If you do, you probably have larger issues than core strength, right? We could hit that nail into the wall with our forehead, right? If we took 1,000 hits and we just pounded away all day, we might get something productive out of it. But the reason we're going to choose the hammer is because it's a much more effective tool to hit that nail into the wall. The same holds true with these ab exercises. You know, we could pound away 1,000 or 1,500 crunches in a day, and I've heard of people getting up to 2,000 crunches, but really what you're doing is the equivalent of hitting that nail into the wall with your forehead, right? It's not a very effective tool to accomplish the task that you want. So what we want to try to do is, we can use some crunches here and there, but we want to incorporate these rotational movements, we want to incorporate these lateral flexion movements, and if we can, we want to incorporate all of those motions, those 4 motions that we looked at the same time. And there's a couple exercises where we're going to be able to do that. This third point here is going to be important here. Choosing function over form. And what I mean by that is not getting caught up in having a six-pack abs. Like I said, that's great for having a beach body and picking up girls, but as an athlete, what your core looks like should be a byproduct of the training, and the training should reflect whatever your goal is as an athlete, right? We already recognize that these six-pack abs that run right down the center of your body here, they look great, but they're not the primary movers, or they're not the primary go-to muscles in the core when we're throwing. We're going to be primarily concerned with these muscles out here and the interaction of all of these muscles. So you can have your six-pack abs, but not at the neglect of being able to do these rotational movements well, or these lateral flexion movements well. So we want to develop the core musculature as a whole, rather than thinking of just doing trunk flexion, where we're just pounding out trunk crunches, etc. So we want to train using different loads, meaning different weights, different modalities like med balls, band, etc. Different speeds. You know, you can train there's a benefit for slower training, for faster training, for everything in between, different movements, etc. Adding variety into the program is going to have a couple of different benefits. One, it's going to really help you continue to progress. If you did the same thing every single day, you soon will stall out in progress. You want to incorporate some variety. The other thing is that by incorporating different kinds of movement patterns, then we can make sure we're hitting all the bases, so to speak. So if we're just doing 1 or 2 exercises, especially if those are somewhat isolation type exercises where we're just using 1 or 2 muscle groups, then we're probably leaving some motions out. We're leaving some ranges of motion out. So we want to try to do all different kinds of motions, different kinds of planes of movement, different speeds, different weights, etc. A couple other considerations. Don't forget about the back. You know, we see the front, it looks great. A lot of people forget about training the back. And the back musculature is going to be really important for maintaining back health, maintaining core health in general. So the last thing you want to be doing is doing a ton of this rotational type exercises, but you lack the strength in the back to balance that strength out. So just like in baseball, where we work on the deceleration muscles of the arm, right? In arm care, which I think Dan is going to talk about shortly, you work on the decelerators for your arm to prevent arm injury. The same thing is true here. We want to work on the muscles that balance out the big prime movers as well. We want to have some type of training for symmetry. So even though we're in a sport that is primarily considered asymmetrical or unilateral, everybody in here probably has a dominant side, spends most of their time, if not all their time, throwing with one hand, hitting with one hand. You want to be doing training that balances that out. And we don't have to have a perfect symmetry here, but in general, if you can get to within 10% or 5% of one side to the other in strength activities, you're going to be okay. We just don't want that to get out of control. For repetitions, it's really going to depend what exercises you're doing. For frequency, it's going to be a good idea to include some level of core training about 3 to 5 times a week. And this is stuff you could do at home. This is stuff you could do in here. Doing core training is pretty easy. If you devote about 10 minutes of it to a day, it's going to go a long way. Don't feel like you have to devote